It's wonderful to see you in person, at least half your faces, a third in some cases. So lovely to be here. I'm just going to introduce everybody quickly so that we have a chance for Will to give his talk, and there are going to be comments after his talk, and then we will open the floor to discussion. We are making an effort to record so that we can share this session with people who are LAWCHA members and others afterwards. So we hope the recording will pick all of you up, and we'll see how that goes. Before we continue, in case you haven't heard, there's been a victory in the Amazon vote. Not in Alabama, alas, but we'll continue to work on this. I'm Cindy Hahamovich. I teach at the University of Georgia. I'm the new president of LAWCHA. Thank you. And for any of you who don't know what that is, that's the Labor and Working Class History Association. We will be having a reception after this session, so in between the two sessions, beginning at 3 or whenever we get done, we will just go over to Constitution B for drinks and snacks and milling around, and then we will have in that same room the general meeting of LAWCHA, and you are welcome to attend even if you are not a member. We have a number of sessions throughout the conference. Unfortunately, another one's right at the same time as this. But there's also a walking tour tomorrow, and you may, if you've already, it's booked up as far as I know, unless Nick tells us differently who's here. But there's a reception at the end of that walking tour, which you are welcome to come to, even if you didn't sign up for the walking tour. So we're going to end up 3:15-ish, I think is the idea, at Democracy Brewing. So you're welcome to join us there. Okay, let me introduce our speakers for today, and I'm going to start with our discussants and then get to Will. Some of them can they not see the?
I think he's only going to up a bit.
Oh, there they are.
I think he's going to put them up.
That's me, giant. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
Okay, well, anyway, some of them are online, and one of them is here. So Amador is an assistant professor of history at Latinx, Caribbean, and Latin American Studies at the University of Connecticut, Storrs. Her first book, The Politics of Care, Puerto Rican Citizenship and Migration After 1917, is under contract with Duke University Press. Jennifer Klein is a professor of history at Yale University. Jennifer has 2 prize-winning books, Caring for America, Home Health Workers in the Shadow of the Welfare State, co-authored with Eileen Boris, and For All These Rights, Business, Labor, and the Shaping of America's Public-Private Welfare State. She has many other publications as well, including in popular publications, but she wanted to bring our attention to one in particular, which was a special issue of ILWIC, the International Labor and Working Class History Journal. There was a special issue on a pandemic roundtable, in which Jennifer has an article called Inoculations, the Social Politics of Times, Labor, and Public Good in COVID America. This is relevant to our session today. Keona Ervin is an associate professor of history at the University of Missouri, Columbia, and one of the organizers of the last LAWCHA conference. She is the author of the award-winning Gateway to Equality, Black Women and the Struggle for Economic Justice in St. Louis, and a recipient of the Career Enhancement Fellowship from the Woodrow Wilson National Fellowship Foundation. Gabriel Winant is an assistant professor of history at the University of Chicago. Here he is in the flesh, not online. His book, The Next Shift, The Fall of Industry and the Rise of Healthcare in Rust Belt America, was published last year. And I personally love it when people put their organizing on their bio. So he's a volunteer organizer with the Emergency Workplace Organizing Committee and a member of the Board of Scholars for a New Deal for Higher Ed and the Policy Committee of Higher Education Labor United. All right, last but not least, Will Jones likely needs no introduction in this crowd, but he is professor and director of graduate studies in the history department at the University of Minnesota and the author of The Tribe of Black Ulysses of African American Lumber Workers in the Jim Crow South, and The March on Washington, Jobs, Freedom, and the Forgotten History of Civil Rights. His scholarship has appeared in many places, including, of course, Labor, Studies in Working Class History, ILWICH, the Journal of Urban History. He's currently writing a book on essential workers, public employees, and the dignity of labor, which he's going to talk to us about today. But of course, Will, for the past 2 years, has also been the president of LAWCHA, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about him at the meeting coming up, but let's just say he has been a wonderful president, and I wish he was still president. Thank you very much, Will.
Thanks, Cindy. Naomi and Jesse just walked in. Do you know you have a session right now?
Nobody there.
Oh,
We talk about organizing public workers at some point, but yeah.
okay. Great. So my last act as president is killing a session on organizing public workers. Yes. Oh, I thought. Oh, hi, Dana. Well, it's great to see you all. It's so fantastic to be here after such a long time. It feels like, has it been like a decade since we went to a live meeting? And it's been, I think we all know it's been a really challenging few years, but actually being connected to LAWCHA has really brought me through it. I think the first in an endless series of virtual events was the last OAH, which we, at the last minute under Julie Green's leadership, pivoted to a remote format. I remember the conversation with Julie thinking, God, that's crazy, we can't do that. And we pulled it off, I think, and maintained our connections to each other and shared our work. This continued through the pandemic book talks organized by Cindy and Mac Marquis, which drew really remarkable crowds for regular discussions of new work, and our LAWCHA conference in 2021, which was planned initially for Chicago, and then pivoted under the leadership of Peter Cole and Keona Ervin to a really tremendous event, drawing hundreds of participants. And I think, obviously we still feel the impact here today. Many of us, most of the people on this panel are remote. Many of us, our members are unable to attend. But I think, actually being here face to face has been a really wonderful experience. So I thank you for coming. And it really makes me look forward to the next LAWCHA conference next year, which is going to be at Rutgers. Jesse Wilkerson and Mano Karuka are organizing beginning to organize the committee. Naomi Williams and Lauren Braun-Strumfields are helping with the local arrangements, and I look forward to seeing you all there. So turning to my talk, first I just want to thank Emma and Jennifer, Keona and Gabe for reading what was, I'll admit, a sort of incoherent stream of consciousness that I sent them a few weeks ago, and wading through that. I'm going to try to be a bit more coherent today, but I hope you'll bear with me. During and shortly after the First World War, a series of crises highlighted a paradox in cities across the United States between a tremendous hostility toward African Americans and a growing reliance on their labor. In Los Angeles, the 1918 flu pandemic pushed authorities to admit black women into the nurses' training program at the county hospital. When over 100 white workers walked off their jobs in protest, the superintendent urged them to, quote, see the matter in its true light and forget race prejudice. In Washington, D.C., labor leaders convinced Congress to increase the wages for the mostly black men and women who cleaned, operated elevators, and guarded federal buildings in the district and other cities. They pointed out that the low wages forced most of these workers to hold 2 jobs, and this in turn made it almost impossible for them to perform the government work. The Washington Post reported that difficulty recruiting garbage collectors and street sweepers presented a real menace with the pandemic and the summer heat. And adding the specter of sexual predation by black men, the superintendent of janitors in the DC schools warned that low wages made it, quote, difficult to get men of sound character and responsibility to be janitors in the public schools, where the moral safety of thousands of girls would be endangered by the employment of unscrupulous persons at the prevailing wage. The most striking instance occurred in Chicago, where the 1919 race riot nearly shut down the city, largely because black workers couldn't get to their jobs. Street sweeping and garbage removal was suspended in 2 wards. Maintenance and construction on streets, sewers, and other public works ground to a halt throughout the city. A quarter of the workforce at the Municipal garbage reduction plant showed up for work. 3 of the city's asphalt plants were closed, laying off 1,500 laborers, most of them colored. Only 5% of the black janitors, clerks, and other workers at City Hall showed up for work. And the Chicago Tribune reported that a rumor that elevator operator James Judge had been killed on his way to work, quote, caused the few colored employees left to grab their hats and coats and take the advice of bureau heads to seek cover until the riots are over. I think these scenes illustrate this tension between a contempt and a dependence upon black workers that resonates with the experiences of essential workers who performed similar tasks and were also disproportionately women and men of color during the COVID-19 pandemic a century later. Before the pandemic began in 2020, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that a demand for labor in the next decade would be greatest in occupations where average pay was less than $3,500 a year. Among those jobs were home health aides, medical assistants, warehouse workers, janitors, and others who soon found themselves on the front lines of fighting and protecting others from the virus. While elected officials and others rushed to praise those workers for risking their lives to provide essential services to others who worked from home, they were slow to raise wages or protect the health and safety of those workers. Troy Bowman, who was an African-American janitor in Minnesota, spoke before legislators who ultimately denied his and other essential workers' requests for hazard pay during the pandemic. He said, "My experience as an essential worker feels like we've been treated as expendable workers." Andrea, who was a hospital housekeeper, who was denied protective equipment while she cleaned an operating room where COVID patients were treated, said, "One minute you are important enough, the next minute it's like you aren't that important to get the proper equipment, but you're important enough to clean for the next patient." How do we explain this persistent tension between demand for essential services and the devaluing of essential workers? In a market-based economy, we might expect high demand to drive up wages. Yet economists explain that the abundance of potential employees, low barriers to entry, and the low marginal value of many services conspire to suppress wages in many essential occupations. There's nothing paradoxical about this scenario, Adam Ozimek told the Washington Post, because so many workers available to take their place, even the most essential workers tend to command a pretty low wage. Marshall Steinbaum points to the erosion of unions and labor regulations that once improved workers' standing and bargaining power vis-a-vis employers. While economists emphasize general market forces and institutions, historians point to a more particular history of devaluing essential workers. Jennifer Klein points to the exclusion of service and occupations and sectors that employed predominantly women, African Americans, and Latinos from labor laws that regulated wages and hours and empowered mostly white and male industrial workers to demand health care and pensions between the 1930s and 1970s. Gabriel Winant emphasizes the interdependence between the industrial and service sectors and the political possibilities created by our collective growing social dependence on institutional caregiving that was exaggerated by COVID-19, but hardly unique to it. These jobs are poorly paid not because they are seen as less important, and they're certainly not the ethically troubling jobs that IL Press asserts we expect less privileged people to perform in our name. These are jobs that we expect to be affordable and reliable precisely because they are so essential to our health, our safety, and our happiness. It is the essential nature of the jobs that have made it so critical in the view of many to reduce the wages and protections of the workers who fill them. Now, these assumptions are rooted in a very long history, as we know, of poorly paid and unpaid domestic labor. But they were transformed by the rapid expansion of government in the 20th century. As government took over responsibility that was previously held by households, it adopted the same expectations that those tasks would be performed out of obligation rather than for wages and benefits. The experiences of Black workers in Chicago and other cities during and shortly after the First World War points to a longer history of this expectation. While the era of big government is often associated with the rapid expansion of federal power during the New Deal and the Second World War, its roots lie in the growth of municipal government during the Progressive era. In addition to helping to explain the exclusions from the New Deal era, this history can help us to understand the persistence of the paradox that we see in the treatment of essential workers today. A critical agent in the expansion of municipal government in the Progressive era was the municipal housekeeping movement, which was led by Jane Addams and other female reformers and embraced by male municipal reformers in the 1910s and 1920s. The municipal housekeeping movement sought to justify the expansion of public services by comparing cities to households and arguing that public services were as essential to public safety and health as cooking, cleaning, and other domestic services were to a family. For Addams and others, this logic also served to justify women's suffrage and the leadership of women in city government. As Addams wrote in 1913, the very multifariousness and complexity of a city government demand the help of minds accustomed to detail and variety of work, to a sense of obligation for the health and welfare of young children, and to responsibility for the cleanliness and comfort of other people. Because all these things have traditionally been in the hands of women, if they take no part in them now, they are not only missing the education which the natural participation in civic life would bring them, but they are losing what they have always had. While municipal housekeeping portrayed public services as essential, however, it also helped to rationalize the low wages and disempowerment of women and men employed in what came to be known as the public household. Frances Perkins Gilman, for example, argued that while city administration should fall to professional women, the dirty work of cleaning and removing wastes passes from her hands into those of men. The city's cleaning is his work, And even in our houses, the professional cleaner is more and more frequently a man. Gilman did not specify which men would do what she called the basest and foulest work, but other writings indicated that she viewed African Americans as particularly well-suited. In a 1908 essay published in the American Journal of Sociology, Gilman proposed to, quote, promote the civilization of the Negro by authorizing state governments to force black people who are not self-supporting into public work, insisting that the proposal was not enslavement, but enlistment. I'm not sure what the difference is. She envisioned military-style work camps where black men would meet, quote, the crying need of the whole South for better roads, harbors, riverbanks, and the general development of the country, while black women would be trained in cooking and cleaning. As Evelyn Nakano Glenn, Catherine Sinisa Choi, and others have shown, the principles of municipal housekeeping extended beyond mainland cities to facilitate mostly white middle-class women's leadership throughout the American Empire in the early 20th century. In addition to the expansion of municipal services, the comparison between domestic and public housekeeping lent urgency to the cultural assimilation of Latino and Asian immigrants in California and Hawaii, the development of US-led healthcare and education systems in the Philippines and Puerto Rico, and the building of housing and recreational facilities for white US citizens in the Panama Canal Zone. By recreating the private domestic realm of the home in the towns of the zone, writes Julie Green in reference to the canal, American women became central to the US construction project. This is one root of the paradox that we still see in service and care work. Whether formally in the public or private spheres, services seen as essential to the public good are expected to be affordable and reliable, like food, cleaning, and care in the household. The racial implications of that logic were reinforced by the Great Migration, which provided American cities with an abundant supply of affordable labor. Sociologist Richard R. Wright pointed out that black migrants found themselves largely shut out of manufacturing and the skilled trades, yet, he said, the Negro unskilled laborer has been a welcomed guest. As early as 1913, Wright observed, hundreds of miles of sewerage and of streets in our great cities are largely the labor of Negroes. In nearly every large city, special employment agencies have been opened in order to induce Negro workers from the South to come north, where there is abundant public work to be done on the streets, sewers, filter plants, subways, railroads, etc. In a parallel process, workers of color provided the labor for a robust system of public welfare for the white US citizens across the expanding empire. In the Panama Canal Zone, for example, mostly West Indian workers provided public services for white US workers in a system that one West Indian activist described as, quote, a socialistic state with segregation, the guiding principle of the various communities. By the 1930s, the assumption in cities across the United States and its empire was that poorly paid, even unpaid labor was critical to the affordability and the availability of essential services. The most blatant example of this was the use of convict labor to build and maintain roads and highways, a system that developed in the South between the 1890s and the 1920s and spread to 28 states across the country by 1930. Echoing Charlotte Perkins Gilman's assertion that forced labor would prepare black workers for public service, Alabama highway engineer C.W. Cooper boasted that his state's use of prisoners on highway construction, quote, demonstrated that with good management, work can be accomplished at a good profit. And when the state sets the convict free, he is in good physical condition and trained for work. But this logic was not restricted to Rhodes or to black men. In a 1930 article titled Municipal Housekeeping, sanitation engineer John Nuttall boasted on how he had reduced the cost of garbage disposal by employing low-wage African-American workers to collect and sort waste in Philadelphia, claiming that laborers had previously made fortunes reclaiming rags, metal, and other valuables from the city dump. He explained that this could be diverted into the city budget by paying mostly African-American men to deliver waste to a reclamation plant where it was sorted by African-American women. Both groups were paid on an hourly basis for time actually worked, rather than on a salary like other city employees. And making explicit the continuities between public housekeeping and low-wage domestic labor, Nuttall explained, quote, "Colored women are used for this work, and many typical mammies are found here." This link between domestic and public service laid the basis for public employees' exclusion from New Deal labor laws. As Secretary of the Navy during the First World War, then Secretary Franklin Roosevelt had been an outspoken critic of conservative proposals to reduce costs by slashing the pay for public workers and also by cutting public services. He was part of a progressive effort to say that public services could be expanded and preserved through efficiency rather than by eliminating them. As he said, Congress must make up its mind to give adequate pay to government servants, arguing that poor pay would undermine the morale and the quality of public services. Just before he announced his candidacy for presidency in 1931, Roosevelt addressed Princeton University's Institute for Public Affairs on the topic of, quote, reducing local government costs without eliminating essential services. Adopting the municipal housekeeping movement's argument that public services were essential to public safety and health, he insisted that increased public spending was, quote, inevitable and necessary, as government has been quite properly called upon to assume an increasing number of responsibilities that once belonged to the individual and to the family. Yet the essential nature of government created a contradiction, in his view, between the interests of the public and those of the workers who served it. And that logic informed the exclusion of public employees from labor protections under Roosevelt's leadership as president, acknowledging that public employees' desire for decent wages and working conditions was, quote, basically no different from that of employees in the private industry. He insisted that those concerns be weighed against the special relationships and obligations of public servants to the public itself and to the government. Now, this, of course, was not the end of the story, and a vibrant union movement emerged almost immediately to challenge those exclusions. Some of the most powerful challenges came from the Canal Zone, Hawaii, and other territories where non-white workers provided public services to mostly white U.S. citizens. But they also emerged in mainland cities where activists challenged the race and gender inequalities that had structured public service since the Progressive Era. Ewart Guinier, a union leader who had grown up in the Panama Canal Zone and moved here to Boston, pointed out that hospital workers in New York City worked 46 hours a week and still relied on public assistance to feed their families. As he said, large numbers of these workers are women and Negroes, meaning that the city is practicing the same policy as private employers who pay Negroes the lowest wages for the hardest jobs. Guinier and others created a union movement that gained little attention until the 1960s, when it started to challenge the exclusions that had hindered public sector unionism since the 1930s. course, the spotlight was shined most brightly by Martin Luther King Jr., who viewed the mistreatment of essential workers as critical to his demand that the United States live up to its founding belief in the equality of all people. "I'm tired of this stuff about menial labor," King told his congregation at Ebenezer Baptist Church in 1965. "What makes it menial is we don't pay folk anything. Give somebody a job and pay them some money so that they can live and educate their children and buy a home and have the basic necessities of life. And no matter what, the job takes on dignity." More famously, in 1968, King credited Memphis sanitation workers with forcing that city and the nation to respect the dignity of labor. So often we overlook the work and the significance of those who are not in the professional jobs, of those who are not in the so-called big jobs. But let me say to you tonight that whenever you are engaged in work that serves humanity and is for the building of humanity, it has dignity and it has worth. As King pointed out, movements like the sanitation workers in Memphis challenged the long-standing assumption that public services could be delivered efficiently and affordably only by restricting the rights and rewards of public servants. The rise of that movement helped renew attention to the essential nature of public services. In the 1970s, Derek Bell and other scholars referred to the public sector as the public household, renewing the progressive belief in the essential nature of public services. But unlike the progressive era, in the late 20th century, unions also transformed public jobs into what Michael Katz called the principal source of black mobility, especially for women, and one of the most important mechanisms reducing poverty. In addition to securing collective bargaining rights in many states, they extended Social Security and fair labor standards to most public employees by the 1980s. Those gains affected not just public employees, but many semi-public workers in nonprofits and charities that provided public services. By rejecting the assertion that the interests of public employees ran counter to those of the broader public, they laid the basis for a union movement that, to adopt contemporary language, bargained for the common good. They also challenged the assertion that productive labor was more important and distinct from reproductive labor, and the race and gender assumptions that were inherent to that old hierarchy. Indeed, it's no accident that the largest unions today have roots in the movement begun by Guinier and other municipal workers in the 1930s, or that those unions are now led by women and people of color. But this movement remains weak and marginalized. By failing to challenge the federal labor law, it was limited to liberal states and subject to intense backlash, as we've seen most dramatically in Wisconsin. As sociologist Jane Collins points out, that was a backlash not just against the gains of public employees, but a broader debate about the value of service and care and the rights of the workers who provide them. As Collins and others explained, service and care work has been seen as unproductive and tangential to the broader economy, despite the essential nature of reproductive labor to the productive process. It is this context in which we should understand the debate over essential labor during the pandemic. As Gabe Winant points out, the renewed attention to the value of service and care work creates an opportunity to improve wages and working conditions, but that will not be enough until we confront the long-standing assumption that access to affordable and reliable public services requires the impoverishment and the disempowerment of the workers who provide them. As the leaders of Chicago, Los Angeles, and Washington, D.C. discovered a century ago, low wages and poor working conditions actually make it difficult to provide us with the services we need. And the truth is that essential workers are in a better position than anyone to determine the quantity and the quality of the services needed by the broader public to bargain in the common good. Dr. King's prediction still holds that one day our society will come to respect the sanitation worker as if it is to survive. For the person who picks up our garbage in the final analysis is as significant as the physician, for if he doesn't do his job, diseases are rampant. As King left us with this eternal wisdom that all labor has dignity. I thank you for your time and your attention, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks. Do you want to?
Thanks, Will. Okay, Emma, Amador, you're up first. Let's see, there you are.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Great.
No, they said no. Hang on.
Okay.
One sec. Talk again, and we have somebody.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Keep talking.
Keep on talking. Hello. Hi, everyone. Is the sound working?
Eileen, hang on. We have a sound guy.
See if the sound works. Okay, I'll just keep on saying hello to everyone. I wish I was there with you in person and able to see the crowd and to get a coffee with a friend and to be there with everyone. But instead, we're kind of disembodied heads right now, but together nonetheless, which is good.
Okay, we'll follow Eileen's instructions. Yep. No, we're gonna have to do it the other way. Hang on. Yep. It's taped down. Okay, talk, Emma.
Hey, can you guys hear me now?
Mm-hmm.
Hello.
All right. I think we got you.
Oh, fantastic. Oh, great. Hello. Again, a lot of hellos. So first of all, I want to say thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to read the fantastic talk that we just heard by Will Jones. I'm so happy that I got to read it and also to get to hear what others are thinking about these important topics. It's an honor to participate in a discussion with scholars whose work I admire so deeply also. The paper was so rich and my comments could go on for far too long, but I've decided to try to organize them around a few themes that I found particularly helpful and useful to my broader thinking about labor history right now. The first is the connections that the paper made between essential work and social reproduction, and the ways that gender, race, and citizenship merge to create certain patterns of care work as a part of service work. The second is the ways that resistance and labor organizing has manifest historically among public and service workers, and how these types of rebellions continue to brew in our contemporary moment. And I'd like to think of those in relationship to the history of U.S. empire that Jones references, as well as in relationship to the history of Latinx communities in the U.S. These themes are of particularly interest to me right now because I'm writing about the history of care workers and the politics of care in Puerto Rico and the Puerto Rican diaspora, and also really invested in thinking about how to write history that captures the vibrancy of the organizing led by Puerto Rican women organizers over the past century under U.S. colonialism. And so I'm excited to think in relationship to this talk. First, I turn to the entangled history of essential work and social reproduction. As Jones powerfully argues, the COVID pandemic has cast into stark relief the reliance of our society on essential workers and public servants, at the same time that these workers continue to be undervalued and not properly cared for in our society. Jones examines the evolution of the categories of essential worker and public worker over time, considering some of the ways that understanding these categories was closely linked to discourses about race, gender, and belonging in U.S. history. He shows how the evolution of public service as a form of housekeeping relegated it to labor that was gendered and raced and therefore unprotected. He also notes that these structures of inequality were predicated on not recognizing the importance of the workers whose labor allowed for the social reproduction of capitalism. Here, this project intersects with that of the work of feminist labor historians of gender, race, and care, like those on our panel, Keona, Jennifer Klein, Eileen Boris, Evelyn Nakano-Glenn, Tara Hunter, Pramila Nadison, this vibrant kind of body of scholarship that has argued that the history of care work offers an important lens for thinking critically about capitalism, social reproduction, and its dependence on both unpaid and low-wage workers. These scholars also show how women of color in particular have long made up this essential workforce, work that is part of a greater conversation today. Jones' discussion of the history of social reproduction also made me think in particular about Laura Briggs's turn of phrase, all politics are reproductive politics, the title also of one of her books. Where she argues in particular that women of color have been at the forefront of struggles to push back against the erasure and devaluing of social reproductive labor. This type of organizing provides a fierce response to what feminist scholars have called the careless state, states that not only fail to support the working class, but that have specifically enshrined a capitalist drive to ignore the reality of interdependence between all humans and humans in our environment. Jones's work contributes to the work of historians like those mentioned before, who have shown struggles to demand a more caring state or to move entirely beyond the state towards alternative structures of mutual aid that have long been at the center of the political organizing of women of color in the US. So the second theme I want to address relates to Jones' insistence on the significance of empire to the story of essential workers. I really appreciated how the address kept empire in the frame of its broader discussion of the history of social reproduction in US. Jones discusses the ways that ideas about social housekeeping were a part of progressive reforms that were essential to the project of US empire in colonial and territorial spaces. This has been especially the case in Puerto Rico, where the work of empire was justified by what historian Eileen Finley has called the project of benevolent colonialism, which was a project often directed by women from the US. However, also in my own work, I consider over time how the creation of state institutions in Puerto Rico and the space of public service also became one where Puerto Ricans, many of them women, sought to organize politically to demand social, economic, and political rights in the face of the persistence of colonialism. For example, we can see in the history of radical demands of the feminist Puerto Rican teachers in the 1920s, struggles for labor rights that echo into our contemporary moment. These educators were demanding an end to colonialist policies of austerity and abandonment that women and public educators are very much involved in the months preceding this talk and in the weeks before, where they're demanding that shuttered schools be reopened and that we pay attention to the fact that Puerto Rico desperately needs more education, social services, and spaces of community organization. Considering the history of this labor and organizing sheds new light on the history of US empire and illuminates how people who have encountered the violence, displacement, and disenfranchisement under it have responded and continue to respond to the persistence of colonialism. These stories contribute to a fuller history of the US. And of course, the history of empire directly relates to what Juan Gonzalez has called this harvest of empire, which has led to the continued growth of Latino communities in the US. This drive towards US imperialism means that these communities increasingly have done significant works of social reproduction as migrants and immigrants in the United States, and who have also faced the kind of innovative and violent deployment of what Natalia Molina calls racial scripts, which serve to dehumanize these communities and make their work increasingly exploitable. So empire has shaped the politics of Latino labor and the movement of these workers into jobs as essential and service workers. So I really appreciated that framing. The history of Latino workers is also one of vibrant resistance in the face of disenfranchisement, and the organizing that was a part of the historical tradition of resistance and labor organizing that Jones highlights among public service workers in the US. He notes that over time, growing numbers of these workers were people of color who were at the forefront of different forms of labor mobilization. And this made me think in particular about the ways that Latinas and in relationship to other groups have organized for domestic workers' rights and household workers' rights, demanded that the home be considered a space of work, and also that we take a more critical approach to our understanding of care work as essential work. However, it also made me think about the broader structures of inequality that lay at the heart of the devaluing of social reproduction. How can we make sense or write about this history of social reproduction in our society? It made me think about the demands that are put upon women and children, both in history and today, to be forced to care, right? This idea of being forced to care. How can we write about and understand these struggles against capitalism's push of women and women of color specifically to do the dirty work, the intimate work, often without compensation, again and again, and even more in the context of crisis and pandemic? Who has to do the work? Who pays the price for this uncaring state and uncaring economy? And these questions are surfacing again and again as I'm working on my own project, and I was thinking about them in relation to the talk. Sometimes I feel like the only way to engage them is through more creative approaches, approaches of historians that are thinking about the freedom dreams of some of these domestic workers, stories of resistance and rebellion like those powerfully recounted about Black women and children in the pages of Saidiya Hartman's Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, the ways that through their rebellion they wrestled against being forced to care and forged lives and communities organized around caring for each other. So in conclusion, I want to say that I found the historical perspectives on thinking about the relationship between essential and care work to be extremely generative. It's more important now than ever to think about, these questions, these kinds of divisions of labor, and the forms of resistance that workers continue to deploy. So thank you so much for including me in this conversation.
Thanks so much, Emma. Jennifer Klein.
Okay, thank you. I'm actually going to try to stand up in order to give this some semblance of normality and giving a talk. I'm sorry I couldn't be there. I was really looking forward to it, but my entire family and I have been sick with COVID for, for the last 10 days. So can everybody hear me if I stand up? Okay, thank you. And I regret not having the opportunity to finally be on a panel with Gabe, my student, my former student. So this is going to be our first chance to be on a panel together. I'm going to jump in with Will's question. How do we explain the persistent that paradox you referred to between the demand for essential services and the devaluing of essential workers? Why is it that essential and disposable are yoked together? Well, I think what marks the lives of essential workers and the experience of essential workers is the degree of compulsion that they face. All of this is on a continuum of compulsion. To start that discussion, I'm going to begin with job training and the long arc of coerced public work. Job training is part an ideological construct in the minds of its proponents, part skills-oriented, and accompanied always with a healthy dose of scripts about work as curative and rehabilitative. So Eileen Boris and I, in our research, found, in looking at care for the chronically ill, for people with disabilities, elders, childcare, that both public and private social agencies saw job training for poor women, especially Black women, in terms of preparation for public sector work. Even if that care job took place in homes, social work advocates of care jobs understood those to be the public work of the welfare state. So a public job was cast explicitly as a solution and an alternative to welfare dependency. It was precisely the public job that would lead to independence. Just as public care labor would rehabilitate the patient or client, it would rehabilitate the unemployed or precariously employed struggles the female worker. And it would lead eventually, as they thought, towards positions with civil service status or civil service type protections, even union protections, stability, the opposite of precarity. So within departments of welfare or departments of social services, training for such jobs included basically cleaning, laundry, cooking, sewing, and bedside and child care. Job training for the public sector thus focused on domestic labor tasks, and one that most likely women had the skills already to do. Yet the same prep classes remained the basis of job training from the 1920s through the 1970s. And so it builds into the wages and the conditions of the labor, those aspects of household. Is my talk, I really want to draw out what Will was focusing on in the paper on the idea of household as the metaphor for this work and housekeeping. So the aspects of household, which are expectations of sacrifice and self-denial. So welfare recipients came to be seen as the ready supply of labor for these jobs and the kind of work and services that the state needed to provide, especially as those needs and demands escalated. So this accompanies the growth of the state. And what it meant for so many African American, Caribbean, Asian women was that ending their dependency and poverty would, decade after decade, within this ideological job training frame, come continually through refashioned jobs in domestic labor. But there's another thread of compulsory or coerced labor that is public work that I want to turn to, which is found among those individuals who were literally captured by the state. Will referred to convict labor in his, and convict leasing in his address. Convict leasing fades out with the building of enclosed and fixed penitentiaries, but the public work of inmates expands perpetually over the entire course of the 20th century. Convict leasing represented a combination of pure punitiveness and the expectation that the penitentiary would pay for itself, would not draw on the budget of the state or the treasury of the state. Certainly both imperatives remained, but they became much more enclosed within the prison gates or contained within it. So we have to think about how the prison system operates as a labor market institution, particularly regulating lower segments of the labor market. With the rising emphasis on rehabilitation, beginning in the early 20th century, carceral facilities began touting the institution's commitment to rehabilitating wayward persons and setting them on a path towards productive life through job training. These facilities included prisons, industrial schools, and psychiatric hospitals. And regularly carceral industrial schools were also were also treated as mental institutions. So I'm going to draw on my Louisiana research that I've been doing over the last several years. At the State Industrial School for Girls, established in 1926, They adopted an emphasis on vocational training. As they put it, quote, "It's our aim to impart to girls and the public in general that the state industrial school for girls is not a prison, neither is it a reform school. It's what its name implies, a training school. Except that the only way out was actually to get parole or discharge when you came of age at 18. So she had to reevaluate her situation, as they put it, and training would, quote, expedite her return to the community as a useful, productive citizen. Waitressing, home economics, housekeeping, laundry, and food service certificates made up this job training. Not agriculture. It was not about sending people into the fields again, but rather into jobs in hospitals, into custodial jobs in public agencies or institutions like laundry service that served large agencies. The Louisiana State Industrial School for Colored Youth, which was established after World War II as a youth detention center for both boys and girls. Similarly, instead of having like actual education, consisted of vocational training with barbering, laundry, food service, woodworking, and in addition to doing field crops, as in Angola, gardening, poultry, and canning, and as they put it, ideal jobs for working in groundskeeping, parks, and sanitation. And female adult prisoners who up until 1963 had been in Angola were transferred to another old prison farm in St. Gabriel at that point, where their job training, vocational training, consisted of laundry, food service, housekeeping, home economics, and waitressing. In the 1970s, the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women finally added typing, vocabulary, and stenography as business education. So we can see how one way in which I think the work that would be done in the public sector by African Americans becomes attached to ideologically devalued work and work seen as servitude. Now, the content of public work and public service expanded into a second stage as inmates were put to work making products for use in state institutions and by a growing range of state agencies. Under the State Use Industries program, inmates at juvenile facilities and penitentiary and prisons made soaps, detergents, floor cleaners, and waxes, as they put it, to form a complete line. Moving into the 1960s, made highway and street signs, road markings. They made metal beds for jails and hospitals. What's my
Just alerting
time?
you to watch the time. You're over it, so.
Okay. Oh, I am? Okay, so I'll like quickly try to run through there. So, and women made garments for all state institutions, uniforms, sheets, covers. So I think that's a second stage of serving public sector institutions. The third stage is when they actually become the public sector workforce. Incarcerated persons become that reserve army of labor in Louisiana. So first it started with the Department of Motor Vehicles, the DMV, that do data entry and a microfilming. This was not surplus labor. The DMV actually laid people off to shift the work to prisons. And again, at Angola and Hunt and other places, they made wallboard partitions for state agencies, did microfilming and other work. So they actually become the public workforce, but even more invisible and unpaid than you would see at all. The two other examples I just want to quickly refer to is what emerges really in the 1990s is payroll and day labor connections, where you actually have a city agency that is responsible for putting parolees to work, and they put them to work on highway construction jobs and other dangerous positions. And so, again, there's this direct connection from prison to city agency to public work being done by felons who have no opportunity. Okay, I've moved this. Workfare, welfare is the other one. Okay, I know, I'll take like one more minute to finish. If
No,
that's okay.
Jennifer, we're going to move on, or we're not going to have any time to move on to the open
okay.
discussion. But thank you so much.
All right.
I believe I'm up next.
Yes,
Everyone
Keona,
can hear me
Ervin.
okay? All right. Wonderful. Thank you so much to Will, to LAWCHA more broadly, just for the opportunity to be on this panel. I love everyone who's on this panel and such a fan of their work. Will, thank you for this wonderful, wonderful research on questions around sort of the essential worker that for me pull together so many critical threads that I think are bound together sort of in, I think, what so much of the great labor histories that we're seeing being published and thought about and written about in the last, I'd say, 5 to 7 years, especially. It just pulls together these threads in such rich and, as Emma said, generative ways. So I enjoyed reading it and considering it. And I think just in my time, I'd like to also sort of point out some of those threads and the ways I think that Will is sort of weaving them together again in ways that are really sort of pushing our understanding in our conceptual understanding really of some of these key themes. And then I'll probably try to land on some of the research that I've been doing, the questions that sort of animate my work around US Black women's history and making some of those broader connections as well. So one of the, I think, key sort of points of entry or just really the way that we think sort of temporally, we think sort of chronologically in terms of what Will is doing here, is that he's proposing a kind of a long history, and using his words, that begins sort of not in sort of the typical 1930s, 40s expansion of federal power sort of moment, key expansion of federal power moment, but takes us back, particularly with this paper, to the progressive era and the significance here of expanding municipal services, right? And so both in terms of chronology as well as levels, thinking of sort of levels of the state, right? It's quite useful, I think, to sort of drill us down sort of at the municipal level and see sort of how these threads are kind of coming together again in a moment in which sort of notions, obviously, of the public good and what governmental responsibility is to look like, where those come together sort of in powerful ways. So I appreciate sort of the relocation to the municipal level, as well as sort of rooting us in the progressive period, where we find sort of these important voices, like what you reveal or what you talk about with regard to Gilman in particular, I found quite important, and gives, I think, sheds new light on the way that we think about, again, the racial logics of expanding racial and gender logics of expanding municipal power, and also, of course, the politics of U.S. empire. So the second theme that that's, I think, for me so important, it gets to sort of what Emma was saying earlier, and that is just sort of the politics of care. And note that long list of scholars, of incredible scholars who have been talking about, writing about, researching about sort of, what care, the politics of social reproduction and of care work, women of color in particular being at the heart of that. and the way, not just in a sense, sort of where they are positioned sort of in the labor market in terms of how we think about care, right? And the devaluing really of the work of women of color, but thinking too of the ways that women have responded, or the ways that they have tried to sort of push back against the devaluing of their labor, right? So I love that this notion of kind of essential work, that Will roots it in sort of the history of social reproduction, sort of the politics of care, and then making sort of this link between essential work and public work, right? So again, these threads that animate sort of labor history are coming together, I think, in powerful form through the research that Will is undertaking, especially sort of the connection between essential work and disposable work, or disposability more broadly. Finally, I've been thinking, just to sort of bring this, sort of connecting this to my own work in some ways, I've been trying to think a lot about the history of African-American women's organizing in ways that sort of, I think, connect well with wayward lives, and sort of thinking about notions of sort of rebellion, or kind of a riotous history, you might say, as she would say. And what I appreciate about what Will's work is doing in this particular regard is the way first that, or the fact that it's in, Black women's labor and ideas about Black women's labor are informing, and increasingly informing over time. I think this really came out in Jennifer's work as well, or comments, increasingly sort of inform the very notion of public in the 20th century, and increasingly inform notions of public punitiveness as well. And so the particular constraints, I think, that in my research, that Black women are confronting in the labor market as public workers themselves, not just as sort of the face, right, or the symbol of the welfare queen, right, and therefore, let's sort of do away with public services altogether, or the rise of sort of privatization in the late 20th century. So not just the face of that, but as workers themselves, as public workers themselves. What are the possibilities of organizing their labor, given those particular constraints, and given those particular ideological understandings of what they, in a sense, represent, both, again, as workers and as symbols of sort of the public. And so, again, Will is sort of, I think, helping me in a lot of ways to sort of open up, again, those conceptual threads to think more deeply, I think, and really more expansively about how this sort of works for me in the mid to late 20th century, in the sort of origins of these conceptualizations. And again, rooting it in, I think, the history of social reproduction, rooting it in the history of women workers of color, and the politics of care, is such a rich and powerful way to sort of think about, I think, this history. And it's bringing together a lot of these threads in quite powerful ways. So I appreciate the opportunity to engage the work, Will. Thanks. And thanks to everybody on the panel.
Thank you, Keona. Last but not least, Gabriel Winant. Why don't you come up here? Yep. Yep. There we go.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, thanks everyone. It's really nice to be with you all, and with many of you, most of you in person, and always really wonderful to be at a LAWCHA event. And I know we're short on time, so I'll be less effusive about LAWCHA and about Will's presidency of LAWCHA than I was planning to be, but know that I was planning to be very effusive about it. I also want to note that I also just want to note that, speaking of our topic today, workers in LA County are looks like about to go on strike. So that's another exciting developing labor struggle to pay attention to. So this paper places the concept of the essential worker in a much, much longer historical perspective than I think I've seen anybody do so far. And I think this on its own is a really important contribution. In particular, the question of war mobilization and the politics of labor supply that surrounded it have obviously been explored by historians before and have been brought to the surface somewhat in discussions of the last couple of years. That discussion is almost always focused on the exigencies of war production. And the question of how to balance war production with military manpower and its demands. So by shifting our attention from war production onto municipal employment, I think Will takes a really key step in helping us think through the ways that COVID has also been different from experiences of military emergency and mobilization in the past, not because it's not an emergency, but rather because the workers rendered essential by the crisis of the pandemic are service providers to the public rather than manufacturing workers in many cases, not all cases. And in this way, whether or not they're in the public sector, they are in many respects more similar to public employees in our past than they are to, say, assembly workers at the Willow Run bomber plant in the 40s. As Will argues, public employment in particular is characterized by certain racialized class tension between the collective social necessity of certain kinds of work, and therefore workers to do it, and the social degradation and intense exploitation of those who perform the work. That contradiction is shaped by both race and gender, and it is also itself a central force in shaping those social categories, more so over the course of the 20th century as this category of employment expands and this kind of work becomes more widespread, and it therefore becomes a more and more important factor, not just reflecting existing hierarchies, but in their making, and of course a more and more important site in challenges to those hierarchies. So I want to try to bring out a couple of questions about this comparison between municipal work in the age of reform and essential work today. One thing that strikes me immediately is a question about the institutional structure of employment. Of course, many of today's essential workers are public sector employees, and it's possible in a very straightforward way to tell a story about them very, very similar to the one Will tells about the earlier moment. On the other hand, though, much of the essential workforce, just read quotes around that because I think it's a complex phrase every time I say it, today works in the private sector, in warehousing and logistics, in food service, and most significantly and notoriously in healthcare. Healthcare is, of course, profoundly shaped, as are most of these industries in some way, by public policy in a variety of ways, but the actual site of employment of a given nursing assistant or respiratory tech is overwhelmingly likely to be private, and quite possibly for profit. So I'm curious to what extent, and I want to think together about to what extent this distinction matters. If the long-term historical continuity that Will observes in the racialized exploitation of service sector workers obtains on both sides of the public-private divide, as I think it seems like it does, that doesn't generate a problem in itself for the analysis, but I think it does force us to ask what is similar about, say, a nursing assistant at a nursing home owned by a private equity fund as compared to a driver on a city bus or a paraprofessional in a school. One similarity, of course, is the layers of the labor force that these industries draw on, since they're often relatively low-wage or precarious jobs or have been carved by deep institutional and sociological patterns into particular racialized and gendered shapes. The patterns of domination of race and gender that Will observes apply on both sides of the public-private line in some form. But it seems to me that we then have to ask why that is. What is similar across different kinds of employment that gives it this shared quality and attaches it to the most exploitable labor markets in this way? And here I think it's important to return to the labor process itself. At the risk of overgeneralization, it seems to me that what many, if not all of these jobs share, are labor processes that are somewhat resistant to productivity increase in the sense that an economist would mean productivity increase. That's to say, they're jobs where frictions exist in the path of efforts to make production more efficient through subdivision and reorganization of tasks, through mechanization, or both. And here I'll note that the very first major observation of an economist of the phenomenon of structural sectoral differentiation by productivity was William Baumol's article on the fiscal crisis of municipal government in the 1960s, which he attributed precisely to this phenomenon as it interacted with the demands of municipal workers for a living wage. So I think maybe I depart here a bit from Will in that I see no reason we can't see these jobs as distinctive without saying that they're less valuable, right? That we can't accept in some way the kind of material and technical particularities of them that give them certain kinds of economic qualities without taking on board all of the ideological degradation that has often followed in train of that economic analysis. It seems to me that this is actually potentially quite useful in thinking about the ways that the paradox occurs between the essential quality of this work, which occurs at a collective and at a social level, and the disposable quality, which occurs at the individual level of a given worker. Labor processes with some version of this characteristic, for labor processes with some version of this characteristic, it seems to me there are a couple possible institutional paths through history. One is that they are absorbed into the public sector under political pressure, in the phenomenon FDR is quoted describing in the paper. Quote, government has been quite properly called upon to assume an increasing number of responsibilities that once belonged to the individual and the family. And again, to generalize, in US history, this seems like a possible outcome in particular for forms of economic activity that it's hard to figure out how to make money off of, yet for which there is a major political constituency and collective social demand. On the other hand, there are the versions that someone is able to figure out how to make money off of, or at least more or less to break even on, and that would give you the nonprofit sector. But to make a profit by investing and employing in these kinds of activities depends on intensifying exploitation even further, giving us the paradox within the paradox that over the course of our history, public sector workers have been continuously subject to racialized and gendered exploitation and degradation, but you'd still really rather work for public sector than private sector in any given industry most of the time. These public and private spheres blur together, of course, because even the privatized areas of activity very often do depend profoundly on public subsidy and regulation. So, of course, what's ended up in the public sector versus the private sector is a product of political struggle, not just mechanical economic determination. But I want to wrap up by trying to think a bit about what this means for the possible power of essential workers, which it seems to me is the thing that we all probably are thinking about and care about. There's a paradox in the concept, as Will illustrates really nicely, which is that we've traditionally thought of indispensability as a form of leverage, and yet that's not quite manifesting in the way that we would sort of expect it to historically, thinking about Teamsters or auto workers in the 30s. It's true, of course, that, say, teachers over the last 2 years, or many public employees at points in the past, such as postal workers in 1970, have been able to win through powerful industrial action. But the way that they win, it seems to me, is not the same as the way that industrial workers win. Teachers win strikes by creating a socially unsustainable situation, since parents need to go to work, schools need to run for the kind of continuation of society. Ideally, parents and students support them in doing this, and teachers win more when they've built those kinds of coalitions, but they may potentially win either way through this leverage. But it's social pressure, and not in any direct way economic pressure, and I think that's an important distinction. It creates political rather than financial leverage on the employer. And I think I'm going to drive this crowd nuts by saying this, but in this sense, what Justice Alito said in his ruling in Harris v. Quinn, the 2014 home care case, which prefigured Janus, was true. Collective bargaining in the public sector is fundamentally political. Now, that doesn't mean what he thinks it means. And he intends it as a justification for limitation of workers' union rights. But I think we can take that same point and turn it around and say that the fact that collective bargaining and industrial organization in the public sector is fundamentally political is also a source of possibility. If essential workers are essential, meaning that the public at large does rely on them, and if their collective action is fundamentally political, meaning that their working conditions are interwoven inextricably with public policy, then they can form the organized nucleus of a struggle not only for better jobs with the state, but for a larger and more functional public sector for all. And in this sense, I think we should see their struggles as the front line of not just the pandemic, but for democracy itself. So I'll stop there. Thanks, everyone.
We're getting an echo from the laptop. I don't know if you can do anything about it, but maybe if you guys mute yourselves, it will help online. And Will, do you want to come up here to take questions?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll just let you call on folks and I'll watch the time.
Okay, well, thanks for all the comments, and I don't want to take up more time. I'd like to just throw if there are questions from the audience or comments, I'd appreciate them. Yeah.
You're going to have to bellow, Deborah, and you might have to repeat the question. So try to keep
a microphone or something, or just shout?
Well, and I can, I'll try to repeat your question.
It will be very short, and it really builds on what Gabe said. As I listened to you and the discussion, which was fabulous, I kept thinking about how can we talk about care work and public sector work or private work funded by public money without talking about tax policy. How would that
Right, yeah. I mean, that's a great point. And I think it actually, and it does build on.
Question.
Oh, the question is, how can we talk about care work and public work without talking about tax policy? And it kind of builds, I mean, it touches well with Gabe's point that, I mean, I do think that I mean, one thing that's going on is the increasing disillusion of the distinction between public and private economies and the sort of intertwining of those. And healthcare obviously is the best example of that, where it's publicly funded work provided at a profit for the, you know, so it's, and I mean, I think it means that we have to look at the funding structure in a broad way, and the degree to which the funding is public, you know, should require looking at, you know, and in some ways I think it doesn't really matter who the actual employer is. I mean, one thing that in the earlier part that I was struck by was actually how continuous that is in the way, I mean, municipal public services actually, the majority of public workforces in a place like Chicago in 1919 are actually not public employees. They're people who are employed by contractors. Like the way the janitorial worked was, you know, there were like, in Chicago, there were like 5 city janitors for the public. The school district had 5 city janitors in the 1920s. Now, obviously, they weren't cleaning all the schools in the city, but they were actually given a lump sum by the budget, you know, from the budget to hire people to do all the cleaning. And they had complete control, and this actually created a scandal because they looked and they figured out that all the cleaning was being done by students. So they were actually, the people they were hiring were students in the schools to do the cleaning, right? So you have this huge workforce, and you see that, I mean, you have the use of day laborers. I mean, that was the case in Memphis. They weren't city employees, actually. They were day laborers who were hired on a day-to-day basis and had no claim to, you know, employment from the city. So I think that line is actually sort of a fictional line from the very start, right? And I think what we need to look at is that it's sort of, where's the money coming from? I think, you know, I referred to the United Public Workers, which was the union that Eric Guinier worked for, and they very pointedly said, you're going to need to raise real estate taxes, and, you know, to fund this. If you don't, you have all these workers who are relying on public assistance to get by, and it's you know, that's coming from the city. So the city's supporting them anyway, you know, but we need to raise taxes. So the tax policy is really an important part of that, and that remains. I mean, AFSCME in the 1970s goes after raising tax rates and, you know, and cutting military budgets. There are these great full-page ads that AFSCME has in newspapers around the country in the 1970s, you know, basically pointing out how many teachers you could hire for the price of one bomber. You know, a tank costs this many schools. That kind of thing is really critical to this, I think. So thanks. Yeah.
I really enjoyed this discussion. I just wanted to kind of also expand the idea of empire and kind of state institutions in creating essential workers and thinking about Native American labor. Indian schools were exactly very similar to what Jennifer was talking about earlier, about this kind of incarcerated kind of forced labor. And that, you know, it's a federally monitored school, so it's a little different than the municipal model. And these places are often in very rural areas, so I think it fits the model we're talking about very well.
Yeah, it really does. And this is something that's been, the question of American Indians in this story, and the sort of particular case of Indian schools, of boarding schools, the way in which they fit into the same model, sort of training, this training purpose. It's also the reliance on Native Americans for actually staffing these agencies. And Kathleen Cahill has a great essay in an edited volume coming out about that. I mean, it points to one of the really difficult things about this is that the distinction between municipal and federal is also a collapsing distinction, right? I talked about DC, right? they're actually federal employees, but you have all these federal employees who are actually doing the same work as municipal, and that would be the case on reservations or in schools.
Well, in the New Deal era, when you had the Indian CCC, they're working side by side with municipal contracts.
Right, right. Yeah. Yeah, thanks for that. That's an important point. Yeah, Eileen.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
I was thinking of Jane Berger's new book.
Yeah.
Which really shows how the fiscal crisis of the state by the 1970s undermines the gains that some black workers, particularly black women, were having in places like Baltimore, her case study. But I remember also in the 90s, the welfare reform, as we called it, you would find often the woman who is working in the welfare bureaucracy barely one step above the woman who she was counseling for public benefits. And it's this devaluing both of the labor of public reproductive labor, but also which workers happen. So I think some of the pushback on the public sector relates to what you're showing about the racialized, gendered groups and how these larger political economy questions really stymie the promise of public jobs, which exist at the same time as we know that promise had many holes in it.
Right, right. And I think, and Jane really does show how important those jobs become. And I think also the difficulty, the sort of impossibility of maintaining that distinction between the public and the workers, right? That they're serving their own communities, and the gains that they make are actually benefiting their communities far beyond their individual households. Yeah.
Will, can I add something?
Yeah.
Because I think we can see that there's two possible, historical models that, one, that work, for example, that Eileen just gave, which is what leads to that contracting out fissured workplace of the state where you get a public-private hybrid that utterly undermines any kind of work security, work decency, work dignity, and becomes dysfunctional in terms of public services. Or we could look at a different historical model, something like CETA, where women themselves drew down that federal money, used it to build their own institutions like Annalise Orlick shows, public libraries, or a medical clinic, a WIC nutritional clinic that served their own communities, removed the idea of servitude and made it more like democratic social community services. And, Tamar Carroll shows this too, I think, in Mobilizing New York, where the CETA money is used not only to train women in skills, but then to staff all these new kind of agencies like battered women's shelters and anti-violence programs and a whole bunch of nonprofit feminist projects that were really a new kind of social infrastructure. So I think, there's two different trajectories in which you could get something that gets away from that whole hierarchical command model of public household to something more democratic and empowering.
Yeah. Could you hear that? I can hear that. Okay. So the president is telling us we're out of time. So thank you so much for the.
Okay, everybody, so we are heading next door for a reception, and then we will have our LAWCHA meeting, awards ceremony. So please join us. If you don't feel comfortable taking off your mask for food and beverage, feel free to go stand in a corner, eat, put it back on, and join the group. Thank you so much for coming, and we'll see you in a bit.